Move aside, those outfits simply won't do. My mother-in-law, Margaret, cut through the air like ice as she physically nudged my children away from the family photo setup. We need these photos to be perfect for the country club's family wall. I watched as my 8-year-old, Emma, filled with tears, clutching her 6-year-old brother Jack's arm. The matching blue outfits I had carefully chosen and saved up for suddenly felt inadequate under Margaret's critical gaze. My name is Sarah Anderson, and at 34, I had spent the last decade trying to meet my mother-in-law's impossible standards. Today's annual family photo session at her estate was just another reminder of how far I fell short in her eyes. "Mom, they're dressed fine." My husband David attempted to intervene, but his voice lacked conviction. Years of his mother's manipulation had worn him down. Margaret waved a perfectly manicured hand dismissively. "Darling, you know how important these photos are. The Carmichael family just installed their gorgeous portraits, all coordinated in cream and beige. We simply can't have." She gestured vaguely at my children. This. I stepped forward, my voice steadier than I felt. "These are your grandchildren, Margaret, not accessories for your country club wall." Her eyes narrowed. "Perhaps if you put more effort into their presentation. But then again, given your background, I suppose this is the best you could manage." The familiar jab at my middle-class upbringing stung, but I have learned to hide my reactions. What I couldn't hide was the hurt on my children's faces. Emma, usually so confident, stared at the ground, shoulders hunched. Jack pressed himself against my leg, his new dress shoes scuffing the immaculate hardwood floor, something that wouldn't escape Margaret's notice. "Sarah," Margaret's smile was serpentine, "why don't you take the children home and change into something more appropriate? The photographer is booked for 2 hours, and we simply must get the core family photos done first." Core family. The words hit like a slap. 10 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children, and we were still outsiders. "The core family is right here," I said, placing my hands on my children's shoulders. "All of us." Margaret's perfectly painted lips tightened. "Isabella," she called to my sister-in-law, "come stand next to David. Let's get the siblings' photo first." Isabella, Margaret's perfect daughter, glided forward in her designer cream dress, taking David's arm. Her 3 children, all blessed with Margaret's blonde hair and country club approval, were already arranged artfully on the antique settee. "Mom," David started again, but Margaret cut him off. "David, darling, you know how these photos need to look. The Andersons can join for the casual shots later." The Andersons, not family, just appendages. Something inside me snapped. "Come on, kids," I said quietly, gathering my children close. "We're going home." "But Mom," Emma whispered, "what about the family photos?" "We'll take our own photos," I promised, leading them toward the door. "Better ones." David called after us, but I didn't stop. I couldn't bear to see him choose his mother's side again. As we drove home, I tried to explain to my crying children why their grandmother was so cruel. But the words felt hollow. How do you explain prejudice and social climbing to innocent kids who just wanted their grandmother's love? That evening, after tucking them into bed with extra stories and hugs, I found myself in our home office, digging through old family photos. I needed something, anything, to help me understand why Margaret had always been so hostile. That's when I found it. Tucked inside an old album David had brought from his childhood home was a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax, addressed to "My dearest David," to be opened upon my death. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's. It was elegant flowing script I had never seen before. My hands trembled as I turned the envelope over, noting the date from 30 years ago. I shouldn't open it. It wasn't addressed to me. But after today, after years of enduring Margaret's subtle cruelty, I needed answers. The letter inside was written on expensive stationery, the kind Margaret would approve of. As I began to read, my heart stopped. "My darling son, David, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, and your father has finally told you the truth about me. I'm not the woman raising you. Your real mother died shortly after your birth." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. Margaret wasn't David's biological mother. She was his stepmother, who had been passing as his birth mother for 3 decades. I sat there in the growing darkness, holding a truth that could shatter everything. Margaret's obsession with perfect appearances, her hostility toward outsiders, her desperate need to maintain the illusion of the perfect family. It all stemmed from her own massive deception. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom's upset. Maybe you should apologize." I looked at the letter in my hands, then at the family photos on my desk. My beautiful children who deserved so much better than their grandmother's rejection. No more apologies. I whispered to myself, it's time for the truth to come out. I spent the night researching, my hands shaking as I pieced together the truth. The letter led me to old newspaper archives, birth records, and finally, a small obituary for Elizabeth Pierce, David's biological mother. She had been a concert pianist, beautiful and talented, who died from complications after childbirth. The photos I found of her took my breath away. David had her eyes, the same ones our Emma had inherited. No wonder Margaret always said Emma's eyes were unsettling. The next morning, after dropping the kids at school, I received another series of texts from Margaret. "I expect an apology for your behavior yesterday. Your dramatic exit ruined the entire photo shoot. The photographer had to reschedule, and you know how busy he is. We'll try again next weekend. Please ensure the children are properly dressed this time. David agrees you were being difficult." I stared at my phone, years of suppressed anger bubbling to the surface. David hadn't come home last night, choosing instead to stay at his parents' house. Typical. But for the first time, I understood why he always chose Margaret. She had spent 30 years carefully cultivating his dependency. I drove to the local coffee shop where I had arranged to meet Isabella, David's sister. She was surprised by my invitation. We had never been close, mainly because Margaret had made sure of that. When she arrived, perfectly coiffed even for a casual coffee meeting, I saw uncertainty flash across her face. "Sarah," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "If this is about yesterday," I placed Elizabeth's letter on the table between us. "Did you know?" "Know what?" Her perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together in confusion. "About David's real mother." The color drained from Isabella's face. She reached for the letter with trembling hands, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she read. This can't be true," she whispered. "It is. I found birth records, death certificates, everything. Margaret isn't David's biological mother. She's his stepmother, just like I'm a stepmother to none of my children." Isabella sat back, her designer sunglasses slipping from her head onto the table with a clatter. "But Mom always said, she always told us." "She lied," I said simply. "And now I understand why she's always hated me. I'm an outsider who might threaten her perfect facade, just like Elizabeth was." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. "I was only 3 when Dad married Mom. I always thought, I never questioned." For the first time, I felt sympathy for Isabella. She had been caught in Margaret's web of lies too, shaped into the perfect daughter to compensate for the son that wasn't truly hers. "What are you going to do?" she asked, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "I'm going to tell David the truth, but first I need your help." She looked up, surprised. "My help?" "Yes. There's going to be a family dinner tonight, isn't there? To discuss my behavior at the photo shoot." Isabella nodded slowly. "Mom's invited everyone. She's furious about yesterday." "Good," I said, pulling out my phone, "because I have a few more guests to invite." The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. I contacted Elizabeth's sister, David's aunt he never knew existed, who lived just 2 hours away. She wept when I told her about David, agreeing immediately to come to dinner. I gathered all the documentation, including old photos of Elizabeth that showed Emma's striking resemblance to her grandmother. At precisely 7 p.m., I arrived at Margaret's house with my children. Emma and Jack were confused but excited by their new outfits, exact replicas of ones Elizabeth had worn in old photos with her family. Margaret opened the door, her fake smile freezing when she saw us. "What are they wearing?" "Family heirlooms," I said sweetly, guiding my children past her. "Isn't that what you always wanted, Margaret? Perfect family presentation." She followed us into the dining room, where David and Isabella were already seated. Isabella couldn't meet her mother's eyes. David looked uncomfortable, still angry with me but unsure why everyone felt so tense. The doorbell rang again. "I'm not expecting anyone else," Margaret said sharply. "I am," I replied, standing up. "Let me get that." I opened the door to reveal an elegant older woman with Emma's eyes, Elizabeth's sister Catherine. Behind her stood two more relatives from Elizabeth's family, all carrying old photos and memories of the woman Margaret had tried to erase. Margaret's face went white. "Who are these people?" "Family," I said firmly. "David's family. His mother's family." David stood up slowly. "Sarah, what are you talking about? My mother is right here." I took a deep breath, looking directly at Margaret. "Would you like to tell him, or should I?" The perfect mask Margaret had worn for 30 years finally cracked. She sank into a chair, her hand clutching her pearl necklace. "David." Catherine stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "I'm your aunt. Your mother, your real mother, was my sister Elizabeth." The room erupted into chaos. David stared at his aunt, seeing his own features reflected back at him. Margaret started trying to explain, her words tumbling over each other in desperation. Isabella sat silently crying. And my children, my beautiful children, watched as the grandmother who had rejected them was exposed as the ultimate outsider herself. The next few weeks transformed our family in ways I never expected. David moved into his Aunt Catherine's guest house, needing space to process 30 years of lies. Margaret retreated to a spa resort, citing exhaustion, while her carefully constructed social facade crumbled. But the real change was in my children. "Mom," Emma asked one morning over breakfast, "is that why Grandma Margaret always said my eyes were wrong? Because they're like my real grandmother's?" I pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Your eyes are perfect, sweetheart. They're a gift from a very special woman who would have loved you so much." Catherine became a constant presence in our lives, filling our home with stories about Elizabeth. She taught Emma to play the piano, just like her sister had, and showed Jack old photos of his father as a baby. For the first time, my children experienced unconditional grandmotherly love. Isabel surprised everyone by being the first to publicly acknowledge the truth. At a country club event Margaret had carefully orchestrated, but was too ill to attend, Isabella stood up and raised her glass. "To family," she said, her voice shaking. "Not the perfect images we pretend to be, but the messy, real, beautiful truth of who we are." The scandal rocked Margaret's social circle, but I discovered most people cared far less about perfect family photos than she led us to believe. One evening, about a month after the revelation, David came home. He looked tired but more like himself than he had in years. "I found more letters," he said, sinking onto our couch. "From my real mom. Margaret kept them locked away all these years. His voice cracked. She wrote to me every day during her pregnancy, knowing there might be complications. She wanted me to know how much she loved me, even if she never got to tell me herself." I sat beside him, taking his hand. The anger I had held onto for so long began to fade, replaced by sadness for the little boy who had lost his mother twice, once to death, and once to Margaret's lies. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We build something new," I said. "Something real." Margaret eventually returned from her retreat, but the power she had held over our family was gone. She tried once to host another formal family photo session, but David shut it down immediately. Instead, we took family photos in Catherine's backyard. Emma wore her hair wild and free, Jack's shirt was untucked, and nobody cared about matching outfits or country club aesthetics. The photos captured genuine smiles, impromptu hugs, and even included Catherine's extended family, the relatives Margaret had kept hidden for decades. "These are terrible," Margaret muttered when she saw them. "Everyone's so casual." "They're perfect," David replied firmly. "Because they're real." A year later, we held a memorial service for Elizabeth. As for us, our favorite family photo now sits above our fireplace. It shows Emma at her piano recital, her eyes, Elizabeth's eyes, shining with joy. Jack is hugging her, his shirt wrinkled and his smile wide. David and I stand behind them, and Catherine beams proudly from the side. It's not a perfect photo by Margaret's standards, but it captures something far more valuable, the truth of who we are. Sometimes, perfection isn't about the image you project, but about embracing the beautiful mess of real family love. Margaret never understood that, but thanks to her lies being exposed, we finally did. And every time I look at my children now, I don't see the flaws Margaret once pointed out. I see the precious inheritance of a grandmother who loved them before they were born. In their eyes, their smiles, and their perfectly imperfect spirits. And that's worth more than any country club portrait could ever be.